Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are waiting on just a few more participants to join us. Thank you for your patience. We'll get started here in a few minutes. Good morning, everyone. We are now ready to get started. Commissioners, I'm now turning on your ability to start your video and your audio.
Hi, Pedro. I can be on till 10:45.
Oh, perfect. Perfect. Much appreciated. Good morning, everyone. Good to see that we're all safe and sound and surviving as best as we can. This is our public hearing on law enforcement training for February 25, 2021. I'm Pedro Nava. I'm the chairman of the Little Hoover Commission. Again, thank you all for joining us. I do want to point out that because of commissioner commitments, we will have a hard stop at 1 o'clock today. The meeting, if we get to 1 o'clock, there are a number of folks that have to leave. So those of you who may not have had an opportunity to engage in public comment, we would respectfully invite you back for our third hearing, because there will be a third hearing on these law enforcement training issues. Let me introduce the other commissioners who are here with us on Vice Chair Sean Varn, Commissioners Ed Beyer, Bill Emerson, Schramberg, Sidley. We also have some legislative members of our commission, Senator Jim Neal and Assembly Member Bill Quirk. And I think I've covered everyone who is on. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all for being here with us. Also with us today are the commission staff. Executive Director Ethan Rarick, Deputy Executive Director Tamar Foster, Product Managers Crystal Beckham, Tristan Stein, and Analyst Sherry McAllister, Anne Hurley, and Rachel Mattioli. To staff, expression of gratitude for everything worked so well for all of our meetings. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping before we turn to the subject at hand. The commissioner's audio and
Mr.
video.
Chairman, I hate to interrupt, Mr. Chairman, but I might mention that your audio is unfortunately somewhat choppy as it was at the last meeting. I don't know if you want to try turning off your video. That might help a bit.
All right. Is this clearer now?
It does seem to be.
All right. My letting me know. Now let's do some housekeeping before we turn to the subject at hand. The commissioner's audio and video will be turned on throughout the duration of this hearing. Commissioners, you may mute yourself if you wish. Please remember to unmute yourself if you want to make a comment or ask a question during the hearing. As is practice, I will be looking to see those commissioners who are unmuted, as that will indicate to me that you wish to make a comment. Or you can always raise your hand and give me a little wave. Audio of our hearing witnesses will be turned on when they speak. Members of the public will be muted during the hearing. As is standard, public comment at the end. Those who wish to make a comment will be unmuted during that time period. If you want to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom by clicking on the hand icon to join our public comment queue. There may be some of you who have joined by phone. You should email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov as indicated on the screen, letting us know that you want to address the commission. Please provide your phone number from which you have joined the meeting so our staff knows who to unmute. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and emails requesting comment throughout the duration of our hearing. As is usual at commission hearings, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We are recording today's hearing, and after the hearing, staff will place a permanent link to the recording on our website and upload it to our YouTube channel and Facebook page. And now let's talk a little bit about today's hearing. This is the second of 3 commission hearings on law enforcement training. In the midst of broad calls for police reform, the central focus of our study is the role of California's Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, or POST, P-O-S-T. The POST Commission plays an important role in setting standards for law enforcement agencies across the state. And lawmakers have regularly looked to training as one way to implement law enforcement reform. Our study will consider the state's role in training and consider important questions about current training requirements. For example, what's working, what's not working? What are the consequences of training to those in the community, and how can training be improved? Today's hearing will incorporate perspectives from community advocates and impacted family members, as well as those in the law enforcement community. 2 weeks from today, we will hold a third hearing on law enforcement training. At that time, we'll examine the lessons that California can learn from other states. This hearing was organized by Tamar Foster, the Commission's Deputy Executive Director. And I'd like to ask Tamar to please introduce the first witness.
Thank you so much, Pedro. I'm honored this morning to have join us Cephus Johnson, who is affectionately known as Uncle Bobby X. Mr. Johnson is a social justice advocate at the forefront of ending police violence in America. After his nephew, Oscar Grant, was murdered by a BART police officer in 2009, he founded 4 grassroots social justice organizations dedicated to raising awareness about police brutality and helping families impacted by police violence. Welcome, Mr. Johnson.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone for this important discussion. I bring you greetings from California Families United for Justice Network. It is an honor to provide testimony as an impacted family on this panel today. I am Cephus Johnson, affectionately known as Uncle Bobby, the uncle of Oscar Grant. Oscar is the son of my youngest sister, Wanda Johnson. I am the co-founder of Love Not Blood campaign, co-founder of California Families United for Justice Network, and co-founder of the National Families United for Justice Network. I have been advocating for police accountability and transparency for 12 years, since the murder of my nephew, Oscar Grant, in Oakland, California, at the Fruitvale BART station by police officer Johannes Mesley while he was laying face down in prone position with his hands behind his back, crisscrossed to be handcuffed. His murder was quickly uploaded to YouTube and social media for the world to witness. There is no horror comparable to witnessing your loved one being murdered on video. That horror is forever etched in your memory, perhaps because it could have been prevented. The power of the police to use deadly force is the most significant responsibilities that we can give any public official. This responsibility must be guided by common sense legislation with the goals of safeguarding human lives and protecting human rights. Since this country's founding, Black Americans have struggled, fought, and died for the right to be free and equal citizens. The long list of Black people unjustly brutalized by police shows that the fight for justice must continue. Current law results in police officers killing far more civilians than is necessary, leaving far too many families devastated and the community less safe. These killings disproportionately impact communities of color. Black people are 2 times more likely to be killed by the police. Oscar Grant, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and so many others deserve so much more from this country. These heart-wrenching murders have sparked protests across America. George Floyd murder was not the first captured by fellow citizens on their cell phone. In 2009, Oscar Grant murder by transit police officer Mesley was captured on cell phone. How many deaths by police could have been prevented if police and agency had listened to our call over 12 years ago for police accountability, transparency, and lapel cameras? Since the murder of Oscar Grant on January 1st, 2009, until today, over 1,300 men, women, and children has been killed by the police in this state of California. The national reckoning of crisis of systemic racism in policing system is critical to dismantling a policing system rooted in the nation's original sin of bondage and slavery. The culture of policing originated from the patty rollers, slave patrols organized by groups of armed white men who monitored and enforced discipline on Black slaves, a system for too long that has perpetuated the criminalization, profiling, surveillance of Black and brown bodies that resulted in the lynching and murder of countless Black people. We have known this truth of police violence for years. In this moment of reckoning, it is crucial that we center the humanity and dignity of those impacted by police violence on this understanding. It is not the issue of training that needs to be addressed. It is the culture of policing that must be changed. Police culture impacts how they interact with citizens they encounter, whether or not they issue a warning or make an arrest, how they respond to a fleeing suspect, how they write an arrest report to justify certain actions, and whether or not they will lie under oath. We must not let this moment pass without sweeping reforms. These reforms must value Black lives. It must push forward policies that calls for police accountability and transparency and common sense legislation that protect human rights and save human lives. Professionalism and ethics are important in policing today because they are the guidelines and rules for law enforcement officers. A study on police behavior, police scholars have agreed that the organizational culture of policing, the set of informal cultural norms that are unique to the occupation of law enforcement, is the most important detriment of police behavior. The policing culture as we know it today is adhering to a code of silence with grave consequences for violating it and maintaining loyalty to other officers above all else. The frequent use of internal cover-up within police departments to protect officers who are habitually offenders of excessive use of force. The organizational structure and culture of policing fuels the most detrimental challenge. Policies aimed at reform, including implicit bias training and body cameras use, fall short because they do not address the root cause of incidents such as officer-involved shooting. The culture revolves around internal policing issues such as civil payouts, taxpayer dollars resolve issues with problem police officers rather than the indictment or trial. The biggest challenge facing policing training is a toxic culture fostered by police recruitment, training, and its leadership. The training with emphasis on officer safety pits officers against the community they serve. A warrior mentality embedded in police training and recruitment affects individuals who may not always be the best fit to deal with social work issues prevalent on the front lines of policing. Let me be clear. There can be no justice for Oscar Grant, Stephon Clark, Miles Hall, Shalene Tyndall, Willie McCoy, Angel Ramos, Kobe Friday, Nathaniel Pickett, Kenneth Roth, Ernest Duenas, and so many more. For I am Oscar Grant. Hands up, don't shoot. I can't breathe. No justice, no peace. Black Lives Matter. These powerful phrases will continue to be a rallying call for fair-minded people seeking to live up to this country's core principle, equal justice under the law and a police accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. In order to try to improve my audio, I turned off my video. So that was my reason for that. I want to please accept our condolences for your loss. And thank you for your powerful testimony. What I noticed with respect to the comments that you made is that your organization is also involved in issues in California and nationally. That's correct?
That is correct, yes.
Thank you. And what can you give us some sense of what do you see with respect to national movement or changes as it relates to training for police officers and efforts to change the culture that you so clearly identified?
So if I heard the question right, on a national basis, what do we see as part of the problem to bring about real systemic change within the policing culture? Is that correct?
And have you seen examples of that? Are there places that you can point to that say, we think that there's some positive change there, we think that people have understood what needs to be done?
It's hard to say in regards to what specifically, because each state is different. I guess, for example, as many of us should know, California is one of 4 states that don't have decertification legislation. So, which is a big emphasis on the fact that officers that shoot here in the state of California that may be involved in a murder usually can transfer from the agency they're employed at and go to another agency. So when we look at that on a national basis, there's many states, you know, give and take, the degree of how it's been formed determines how consistency that takes place. And so on a national basis, when we talk about decertification, that is what I feel should be a blanket national legislation that helps create a database so that these officers not only can just transfer within state, but out of state too. Of course, just last year or 2019, when we passed AB 392, California Act to Save Lives, the national use is a state use of force legislation. Of course, many states, again, because of the Peace Officers Bill of Rights, variance on each state determines on how these national pieces of legislation can lay across each state. And so it makes it much more complicated and more challenging because of that issue, the various degrees of how the police unions and Bill of Rights apply in each state. I think overall, when we talk about what we've seen that we can give some raise to what we believe that can be working is accountability. The most important aspect of this whole process of seeing legislation and training that work is how officers are held accountable for the wrongs that they commit. If you know, and this varies in each state, again, it's not a national piece of legislation that exists, but various states take more action or depending on the act that was taking place, would take action in forms of accountability and transparency. So transparency on a national level is critical in each state, as well as accountability, because holding officers accountable for the wrongs that they commit would change the whole culture, the whole culture of policing on a national basis. And that's where we really fell at. So we see it happening in various states, but in the state of California, only one officer has ever been held accountable for on-duty shooting of a person of color, and that's Johannes Mesmer, who shot my nephew, but he only did 11 months. You know, and so that failure in itself, no matter how much training takes place, is not a deterrent to officers not taking the ethics and the professionalism to the highest degree. Accountability will enforce that, because then officers will understand violation of investigative reporting, violations of de-escalation tactics, violations of lying, even following procedures wrong when it comes to shooting someone in the back or choking them out or using a knee on their neck and causing them to die, can be you know, powerful moves that will stop even the essence of just turning off lapel cameras in the engagement of a young man or a person of color being stopped. You know, I know I've said a whole lot, but I add this last piece, AB 953, the Racial Identification Profiling Act, as we know, has put together data that gives a reference to how many people of color are being stopped, and then at the end of that stop, what usually occurred. And I'm sure, because I believe there's a meeting today with the Racial Identification Profiling Commission concerning the data that they have found. But just from our perspective, the data that I've seen in the past really shows how this culture of racism still exists to a high degree within the policing agencies themselves. And so there's a lot of work on our part, but I believe the training should really entail uplifting a cultural change, highlighting how important ethics is, and of course, definitely how accountability can be applied. And I'll close with this. We all know that the training when it comes to engagement of a young white man in a middle state crisis in a white community requires officers to engage that young man and create time and distance. And then they will talk him down and make an arrest. If they don't make an arrest, they'll take him to the hospital. If they don't take him to the hospital, they'll take him to his parents. But that same situation in a Black community, the officers don't create space and time, nor do they even try to attempt to talk them down. They shoot first and then articulate why the shooting took place. You know, so we know the training has been great. We know the training works, but it depends on who's being engaged when that type of training comes into play. You know, so, you know, I end it there.
Well, you're not going to get to end there, Mr. Johnson, because I think Commissioner Lee has a question for you.
Sure.
Mr. Johnson, thank you very much for attending today and providing such provocative testimony. It's very important that we hear from you. And again, as Pedro has said, my condolences, our condolences to you and your family. What I'd like to ask you a little bit about, I appreciate what you have now indicated is a problem about decertification, and that California being one of the states not having a decertification process. I am curious as to how those states that do have decertification, have you seen real change with that process? And so if you could talk about that so we could have some evidence to suggest that this is a very important path. Secondly, I'd like to hear your views, if you would, on recruiting officers and how we go about recruiting officers, and maybe if part of the problem with training is how we are recruiting the officers to do their job. So I'd be very interested in your views. Thank you.
Yes, so a part of the coalition that is working with Senator Bradford on, of course, decertification, we've taken a look at, of course, various states throughout this country, of course, Florida, as well as Georgia, who appears to really have made some tremendous strides in decertification. And even the idea that the moral aspect of policing is also considered in decertifying police officers. as I spoke about earlier, ethics. And so, yes, we've seen some positive change with various pieces of certification legislation throughout this country. And again, I'm citing Florida as well as Georgia, and there's others. Now, to the question of recruiting. Recruiting has to be more based on the ethics and moral fortitude of individuals. I believe, and this is me speaking, that recruiting is based on one's interest in saving the community, which takes them beyond the idea of morally doing it right. It's more about physical strength. It's more about being aligned with the so-called blue code, being a brother, and being more above the protect and serve aspect of policing. So how do we identify these particular bad apples, or how do we identify the good ones that we believe that can actually be employed as an agency, comes from some perspective of their history in life. What school they went to, what social organization they've been a part of, what have been their community involvement in their communities. And then, of course, a history of being clear that they've been pretty honest in everything that they've done and taken a ethical right step in doing the right thing. No longer do I believe that we can just hire someone that's been military trained in the military and has some military policing background, now wants to become a police officer in the United States. That warrior mentality is even ingraded even more so for those particular selections. And then you got those that come off the street or come out of school that just wants to be a police officer, but never have ever dealt with people of color. That is a whole, another area that we have to identify. We got those type of individuals. Special training has to be incorporated in bringing them into alignment that everybody should be treated equally. So I hope I covered to some degree your question.
Thank you. I think Sean Varner.
Yes, thank you.
Sean Varner has a question.
Good morning, Mr. Johnson. One of the profound statements throughout your testimony is the aspect of the culture of the police force and how you change the culture within. So, and you just stated something that I think is critically important, is kind of changing the mentality of the militaristic aspect of the police force and making it a community force, or a community engagement entity. And so I was wondering if you've seen anything through your engagement throughout the country where a police department has successfully engaged in community interfacing so that the officers actually know the community within they work. They have a relationship with them, and there's a more humanistic approach to being a police woman or a policeman in the communities they serve.
Yeah, I would say my wife talks about her experience, and this was basically in Phoenix, where the officers took the time out to, instead of taking her to juvenile hall or taking an individual they'd take them to the Boys and Girls Club and spend some time with them, communicating to them about life and giving them the perception that I'm not about just arresting you and charging you for a crime or because you was involved in a fight, disciplining you for that, but helping you see a better way of living. There is examples that I can cite more so today. I believe it would be Palo Alto, if I remember correctly, when Ron Davis was the police chief there, that basically helped really establish a community relationship with the police officers and by getting them involved in the community. because there was a time when East Palo Alto shooting was just off the chart, and the violence that was happening within the police and the community was, again, off the chart. He brought in a sense of policing that was more community orientated, to where the divide began to diminish, and people begin to see less shootings and violence take place between the community and what the police were perpetrating on the community. So, you know, my overall final response to that question would be, Black police officers in Black communities have an understanding of an engagement of a young Black man or a young Black child, and will have the compassion to engage in a way that will reduce the possibility of a real confrontation take place. So we know that it can be done. There is a sense of compassion that has to be developed within officers that understand that this is not a combative situation. This is an individual that could be in a crisis or needs some form of communicating that gives the sign of love, you know, and respect and care.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. You don't leave yet. Now, I got to tell you before, I want Assemblymember Quirk has a question, and then Commissioner Byer. But I've noticed you've got somebody whispering in your ear. You want to introduce that person?
You know, my wife is always a part of my conversation because she's so involved, you know, and I mentioned her earlier because, no, I'm not on mute, because she, you know, she likes to share that this is not an indictment against all police officers, you know, because we know that there's a small percent that is classified as bad apples. But because we haven't had the right sense to get rid of the bad apples, it has created a perception that the entire force could be considered bad. So my wife always cites her own upbringing when it comes to an engagement with a police officer and how they saved her life. And I don't know if you would want to hear from her right at this moment, but she said no. But she, you know, which is so powerful because, you know, it sets the understanding of children relationship with police officers when they have good experiences. Now, even though she's the auntie of Oscar Grant and has been dealing with police violence for over 20 years, starting with Saigon Penn and out of San Diego. I don't know if you know the story where the young man actually killed the police officer in self-defense and ended up beating the trial. And then some years later, he supposedly committed suicide. But that was her first real involvement in policing violence. And she's been involved ever since. And of course, you know, when Oscar was murdered, she was there for the whole time. And so, yes, she always helped me not forget various pieces of our struggle that we need to highlight more so, because it's so important that we all understand where we're coming from with our perception and understanding how to deal with this situation.
Yeah, I saw her hand, and I thought if she wanted to say hello, that she ought to be recognized for her contribution. She may not want to. I don't want to put her in it.
Right.
She doesn't want to do it.
Say thank you all for this panel. It's very important, and that hello everyone, and that the fact of community policing is the most important aspect of this whole thing. Because to me, I think policing the way that they are in school is traumatizing. Well, when we was in school and the police came, we was like, hey, officer. But if you have police traumatizing your community on a daily, and then you have them in school, that's too much. That's too much for our children. They won't be able to find a way to communicate and have a relationship with police. And so I think it starts with the children. Our motto is it's always, always, always about the children. So like with me, you know, police officers saved my life, 3 of them. 3 Black police officers at a crucial time in my life where my whole life had changed. I had went from being in a home with 3 meals a day to the projects. That could have been a whole different story if these police officers had not guided me aright. And so I just think that it's important that we hold police accountable. I feel like that it will be the key to community policing. Everyone is held accountable. How come the police can't be? And it's not personal against the police or the police. It's just, like my husband said, common sense legislation. So we need an accountability bill to hold police accountable. What does that mean? That if you do something wrong, you got to be held accountable. And that's all. And I'm sorry, y'all.
Not at all. No, I think your contribution was important, and you know, none of us walk alone. And Mr. Johnson, it sounds to me like you're very fortunate. Assemblymember Quirk, I think you have a question, and then Commissioner Byer.
There we go. Thanks. I've been on the Public Safety Committee in the Assembly for 8 years, and I've had the pleasure of working with now Senator Bradford. He has the bill this year to decertify police officers. It was on last year. We didn't know how to cope with COVID, and the bill never was able to get through the system, but I believe it will this year. It's also jointly authored with the Assembly President Pro Tem. So it is a bill. And by the way, Senator Bradford, an African-American, is chair of the Public Safety Committee. It was an excellent choice. We also have an African-American, Reggie Jones Sawyer III, who is the chair of the Public Safety Committee in the Assembly. So this bill is, I think, going to pass. I'm asked to be a co-author. Anyway, I also now, so Uncle Bobby and Auntie, I have never heard a better exposition, and I'm talking about listening to these for 8.5 years now, never heard a better exposition of the problems on the police force. And I wanted to concentrate on the question of this informal culture. I was listening to the other day, I have a professor from Georgetown University in the law school who spent several years as an auxiliary police officer. And she said, when you go through your rookie training, that they're always teaching you how to deal with situations where you're going to be shot dead. And they have all of these films of officers being shot. In fact, if you are a police officer, the statistics show you are less likely to be murdered than the average male if you're a male police officer. This is pretty remarkable. And I go to these remembrances every year, and occasionally there's a police officer who's shot. Most of them die in traffic accidents. And because it's, you know, in the line of duty, we do commemorate them. But the rate of police officer deaths is in fact very small. And as a result of what I've heard from you today about that culture and listening to others, I think we really do have to change the training to reflect that you're much more likely to kill an innocent person, particularly if they're African-American, than you are to be killed yourself. Mm-hmm. And that this leads to hair trigger and poorly planned policing. And I think as a result of listening to you, I think that that's an important point you've made. I want the committee to please note this, the informal culture, and to examine what we're doing in training that might promote this, that the idea that you are so likely to be shot that it would cause you to shoot others. So please make sure that we do more research on this and do include this in our report. And I think this informal culture that you talk about is extremely important. And if we don't do something about that, we're not going to solve anything.
Right, right. Thank you for that. That was, I definitely appreciate your input on that, because as an example, during trial, the defense attorney, Michael Raines, made the argument that because of Johannes Mersley consistent practicing drawing every day, maybe 100 times every day, it committed within his mind this muscle memory. So anytime he engaged a stressful situation, the possibility of thinking through the process is thrown out and muscle memory kicks in. And if you harbor any real biases or disdain for people of color, without thinking, your muscle memory will automatically cause you to shoot the individual because you're protecting your life. And this is how he argued, or John Mesney made his statement, that he didn't want to die. And so his ability to think beyond dying took away from the reasons of understanding that when Oscar's hands were crisscrossed behind his back to be handcuffed, there was no threat. But because he was committed to muscle memory and no longer thinking, he pulled his weapon, as we saw, and shot Oscar in the back. And of course, later on alleged that he meant to use his taser rather than his weapon. But even with a suspect with his hands behind his back, prone down, don't even deserve to be tased. So how could you even think that you meant to use your taser when there was no reason to even consider using your taser? But anyhow, I appreciate what you just shared, which is so true. That informal training that these officers get, you know, the failure to discipline an officer or even consider looking at what could be done with this officer that has been, a complaint has been filed against for use of force, excessive use of force, and not taking the right position on that and just kind of letting it go by. And then he's involved in another, you know, these are mechanisms that creates in the officer's mind that he can't be held accountable for anything. And so it takes off, you know, and I mean, I know I've read studies where the officers that shoot once or the officers that are involved in excessive force are officers that are more likely to respond again in that same act. So there's a very few officers that have acted so egregiously that they've been involved in more than one use of force, excessive complaint, or one more than, you know, unjustifiable, as we state, police shooting. And I'll close with this. If you take, the commission should study the Vallejo Police Department. The ex-attorney general actually, I know, was going to be investigating, or I don't know if the investigation is still taking place, but the California Department of Justice was going to investigate the Vallejo Police Department. Now, we got 100 officers on the Vallejo Police Department, and I believe over 50 of them have been involved in a shooting, and 1/3 been involved in more than one shooting. That's you know, that's over and beyond what any agency should look at as appropriate, you know, according to that agency standard of protect and serve. That is a problem. A lot of these officers factually have transferred from other agencies because they were either in trouble there or whatever had happened. They got to Vallejo, came on board, and that same act they did in the agency they left, they done brought to Vallejo and been involved in a shooting or beat up an individual or even falsified the police investigative report. You know, and so, you know, I think that could be a good case study for the commission to understand just how egregious this problem exists. Vallejo is a small police department, but one of the most vicious policing agencies in the state of California.
I'm going to suggest that we have an Uncle Bobby video at every post training for rookies and perhaps a review. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Assemblymember Kurtz. Now, Commissioner Beyer has a question, and then I'm going to suggest that we give Mr. Johnson the opportunity to step off the screen after this. You're welcome to remain, but we do have additional witnesses that I want to provide time. But Commissioner Beyer, please.
I will be succinct. This is the book that the senator was referring to by Rosa Brooks, the Georgetown professor. My question really starts with the decertification, and thank you for the testimony In Georgia, several thousand police officers have been decertified. So we know that from another state that that's possible. But I want to segue to the topic of our study, which is training. And I was disturbed to learn that police officers who were field training officers were involved in the George Floyd, Tamir Rice, and Freddie Gray matters. And it's motivated me to ask this question. Should there be a process for vetting or doing a background check for people who are selected to be field training officers? Because if the model of behavior is set by somebody who has a disciplinary problem, excessive use of force, or things that are less than a conviction, which seems to be the dominant standard for decertifying a police officer, would that be one way of getting to improving the training function by having different personnel and being able to screen them more accurately?
I would say yes. You know, now I think about a couple of examples. I believe it was Officer Betty, I forget her last name, the officer, the white female who shot Philando Castile, if I remember correctly. After that shooting, of course, it was considered a justifiable homicide. And then she was promoted to a trainer in regards to police shootings. And there was a conference that was going to take place in New Orleans where she was actually going to give a presentation in regards to how, again, to articulate your officer's involvement in a shooting, to make sure that, you know, and this is me paraphrasing because I remember it, but I'm paraphrasing, but basically how an officer can articulate to overcome the obstacles of being held criminally for that particular shooting. Of course, the family reached out to California Foundation United for Justice and other orgs all throughout the country, and we were able to advocate to the organization that was sponsoring this big conference to not allow her to be one of the facilitators in the training. And so, yes, that in itself doesn't give way to a rookie, to me, police officer that is getting that type of training. Another example would be, could you have that, turn that down? Another example would be, I believe it was Andy Lopez, 14 years old, that was killed in Santa Rosa. I forget the officer name, but he had been involved in a couple of shootings prior. He stated and articulated that how an officer can articulate, again, how to justify their shootings if they're involved in a shooting. This way they cannot or will not be held criminally liable for that shooting. So I would, in response to your question, would say that's an important step, because it's hard for us to ever overcome this issue if we're allowing officers that's been involved in these type of acts now are training others on how to escape a questionable shooting or escape a questionable excessive use complaint.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Thank you, Commissioner Byer. I'm going to, at this point, again, thank you, Mr. Johnson, and please express our gratitude to your wife for being willing to share some information with us. I think it was very, very helpful. And it's clear that your testimony has made an impact on the commissioners, because there are ideas and recommendations that you put forth that they've embraced and asked us to further explore. So thank you. So,
can I just say one thing right before I go? I'm sorry.
Sure.
You know, thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this discussion today. I think it's very powerful and it's appreciative of us as impacted family members, because we're clear that basically in 2016, part of 2015, when we became able to sit at the table and have these discussions, there's been various pieces of legislation that has passed that has been chipping away at the police officers' a Bill of Rights. You know, in other words, of course, AB 71, the use of for data collection, there was small involvement on our part, but that was passed. That gave us the data. Then, of course, AB 953, the Racial Identification Profiling Act. Many of the families throughout the California Families United for Justice was at those hearings and at the commission board meetings and being able to be heard. And then, of course, with Nancy Skinner, Senator Skinner bill, SB 1421, you know, the right to know, the transparency legislation that passed was a powerful piece of legislation, because now we have the ability to become more proactive in dealing with the situation of bad actors, you know, especially when it comes to sexual crimes, falsifying police records, and even shootings, whether they were a murder or not. And then, of course, AB 748, the audio video release, because families suffer for years not knowing, having a chance to know what happened when they're told that they have video or audio that can help the family better relate and understand this pain of what happened to their loved one. And just recently, as we know, AB 392, Dr. Shirley Weber's, you know, California Act to Save Lives, use of force legislation. And just with that legislation, to give an example of how things are starting to turn, the young man killed in San Diego, Nicholas Bells, the officer was charged and the DA cited AB 392. And then, of course, Stephen Taylor that was killed in San Leandro, DA Nancy O'Malley cited AB 392. So we have some changes beginning to take place, but the involvement of families being able to talk about this and speak to you to help bring more, I want to say more clarity. I think Cornel West said it the best. If you want to hear the truth, you got to let the suffering speak. And so I want to end it there by saying thank you. We really appreciate this, and I'm sure families will appreciate it too.
Thank you, sir. Tamar, would you be so kind to introduce our next witness?
Yes, of course, thank you. Our next witness is Mr. Hans Menos. Hans is Vice President of Law Enforcement Initiatives at the Center for Policing Equity, which is a research and action organization that identifies and analyzes ways to reduce the causes of racial disparities in law enforcement. He previously served with the City of Philadelphia's Crime Victim Assistance Program, and he also has served as an adjunct professor at both Long Island University and Fordham University Graduate School of Social Service. Welcome, Mr. Menos, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks, Tamar. Just a quick clarification on my intro. I appreciate you introducing me. With the City of Philadelphia, I was the executive director of the Police Advisory Commission. And prior to that role, I was in a victim assistance role. Just wanted to clarify that. So good morning. It's actually afternoon here, but thank you for having me, commissioners. And thank you for the opportunity to testify before the Little Hoover Commission. As noted, my name is Hans Menos, and I'm the VP of Law Enforcement Initiatives at the Center for Policing Equity. I was invited here today to discuss law enforcement training and the role of post commissions in that training. First, for background, the Center for Policing Equity, CPE, is the largest research and action organization focused on equity in policing. CPE maintains the National Science Foundation funded National Justice Database, which we understand is the largest collection of police behavioral data in the world. Our work focuses on combining police behavioral data with psychological survey data and data from the US Census to help communities and law enforcement agencies identify contexts and conditions that create risk for biased behavior to emerge. The goal of our work is to elevate the voice of Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and other marginalized communities, and to help police departments use data to hold themselves accountable, not just for crime, but for the outcome of police actions on communities that they serve. As many of you are aware, law enforcement training is simultaneously framed as the cause and the solution to problems we collectively identify in policing. In any profession, foundational training and continuing education are paramount so that professionals can stay up to date with the dynamic and evolving world. This is especially true for individuals such as police officers who are given the outsized power to take away life and liberty of the people that they encounter. Given this power and the subsequent abuse and misuse of this power, advocates have for decades demanded that chronic and acute issues be addressed by police executives and government leaders. Some examples of these problems include racism, implicit bias, de-escalation, use of force, mental health, and procedural justice. In jurisdictions around the country, the solution offered by leadership and advocates is increased or new training. Often the cost of these trainings is significant, but the efficacy and effectiveness are unknown because they are rarely measured. The result is that communities are often offered a response to their concerns, which may or may not actually address their demands. And for police officers, this means that they may remain unprepared to meet the expectations of the communities that they serve. Measuring the outcomes of training in the real world would help police departments and communities understand if they're collectively accomplishing what they aim to accomplish via training initiatives. These assessments can also help communities hold police departments accountable and ensure police departments hold themselves accountable to community expectations. So I referenced effectiveness in training. This differs from efficacy in training, which focuses on how trained officers perform in an ideal or controlled environment. Effectiveness focuses on how trained officers perform in the real world. If training does not impact real world behavior, then it has not been an effective training. In order to align training with fieldwork, assessments need to focus on effectiveness. Continued failure to do so can lead to continued harm done to communities and continued delegitimization of police. Other consequences include continued misallocation of funds, which could be spent on other initiatives or on more effective training. In practice, using data to make decisions and assess effectiveness of training starts with understanding what problems you're trying to solve. CPE regularly identifies potential problems for law enforcement in the areas of car stops, pedestrian stops, use of force, and arrests. These analyses identify disparities after controlling for factors outside of the control of a law enforcement agency. To some jurisdictions, the solution to this problem identified could include training. In order to determine if this training is an effective tool for an identified problem, a rigorous assessment of the same data points would be helpful in determining if the desired outcome was achieved. As usual, the use of accepted scientific methods, including control groups and regression analyses, will enhance confidence in the findings. For instance, if a training on de-escalation is designed to reduce a disparity in use of force, then measuring the outcome, which is of course the rate of the use of force before and after the treatment, would offer some insight, and including more rigorous methods such as control groups or identifying variables, which strengthen the findings. In order to be successful, an evaluation plan should be considered in tandem with any training plans which are considered. Given the expense of training and the potential for inadequate training to harm communities and delegitimize law enforcement, post commissions do have a role in the regulation of all training. Post commissions could create an accountability system which certifies and recertifies instructors, including guest instructors. Additionally, they can mandate diversity in the composition of training staff and establish recertification requirements. Post commissions could screen all curricula and courses to ensure that they're evidence-based, and they could also mandate rigorous assessments on training focused on bias, racism, de-escalation, use of force minimization, and procedural justice, or any other training which affects the public. Further, post commissions can establish values and standards for training and prohibit any training which does not meet those standards and values. This would include regulating the dosage of training, which disproportionately focuses on use of force. This would also include an explicit prohibition of the inclusion of false narratives, which reinforce negative police culture and the us versus them mindset. Finally, post commissions can ensure that the values and standards they create are responsive to vulnerable communities.
Let me interrupt you, and I apologize, Mr.
No, not at all.
But what happens is that oftentimes witnesses will say something that will spark a question in a commissioner, and Commissioner Sidley has indicated that she wants to ask you a question. So pardon me for interrupting you midstream. I do know you have some more information, we will get back to it. So
certainly, and I'm happy to take questions. I submitted my testimony in writing, so I can stop there. And I'll just say, if you don't mind, quickly, that at CPE we focus on vulnerable communities. And my only other point was really going to be that post commissions need to reflect those communities. And that right now, the ongoing conversation is that these post communities do not necessarily reflect communities, and that's another important point that I wanted to make. But I can stop there. I've submitted my testimony in writing.
Thank you, Commissioner Sidley.
So thank you very much for being here today and providing this important testimony. I have sort of a couple points, and then I'll turn it over to you. One is, mostly when we've been hearing about training, people talk about the number of hours that police officers are supposed to go through. I find that to be not necessarily helpful so much as what they should receive as training as opposed to the number. I mean, if I get 100 hours of the wrong thing, it's useless. So I'm wondering if there is maybe a database or something that you're aware of that provides analysis as to effective training. I mean, I would hate to see that we're making these poor officers sit in training that is not useful. Mm-hmm. And so maybe we're offering too many hours of something that's not useful. And secondly, I'm wondering if you have seen it when you're talking about going back and looking at efficacy of training, is there a program by which if there is a use of force, that then somebody goes back and looks at the training that that officer has received? And maybe there is a problem in the history of the training that the officer has received that people would notice if the study is to go back and look at what that history of training has been for that officer, and then this use of force matter. And maybe would that be, if we don't do that, should we be doing that for every use of force? You go back and look at training. So those are my two areas of inquiry as we look at training and make it important and useful to the officers.
Well, thank you for those great questions. So I'll take them one at a time, but both are really, really relevant and valid. In 2016, PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, did catalog hours of training. So you're correct, that's usually the conversation. And they did highlight a big disparity in that, there's an overwhelming amount of hours, 58 hours on training. I'm sorry, can you hear me? Okay, great. I thought that was it's just an announcement that I'm being spotlighted, I'm sorry. So yeah, there's 58 hours for training on how to use a gun and 49 hours on tactics, which are framed as defensive tactics, but only 8 on de-escalation and crisis intervention, right? So on their face, it's a problem, but I think you make a great point, and it's a point that really aligns with my overall thinking on these things, is that we don't want to just say, give them 50 hours, because 50 hours of bad training is a bad 50 hours. So the question becomes, how do we know what works? Robin Engel, and I can make sure that everything I reference here, I sent to Tamara. So I'll make a note to send the 2016 PERF report that I just referenced, and I'll make a note to send the Engel report. Dr. Robin Engel did a systematic review of trainings that have been done around the country on implicit bias de-escalation. I apologize. And so what she found was that we can't even answer this question yet as a country because so few analyses have been rigorous enough to say that this works. We have a bunch of analyses, and so everyone should be applauded for their efforts. But one of the points in my testimony that I wanted to get to was make sure that you're planning for the analysis when you start paying for this $1 million program, because we need to understand if that was money well spent, if that was an effective training, if that was time well spent. And so we can get there, and I'll send you Professor Engel's paper, which is way better than how I can describe it. But the general consensus there is that we spent a lot of money on implementing new trainings. And many of them have been in response to high-profile incidents, to community demands, but not enough commensurate funding on understanding if we're doing that effectively. So I hope that answers your first question. If it doesn't, just let me know. The second, you asked about a review of these high-profile or any real use of force incidents. So there's a school of thought that says that we should treat any use of force as a catastrophic failure, right? And catastrophic failure is not, meant to be hyperbolic. This is a term that they use in the aviation and medical industry to say, when something goes bad, we need to really look at it. And so there are groups, and I can send this to Tamar as well, that focus on these whenever called, high profile or any incident that can be deemed catastrophic, and they'll go back to the root cause of these issues. They're sometimes called root cause analyses. They're sometimes called sentinel event reviews. But regardless, the point is to do what you're referencing, to understand how do we learn from this to prevent this happening in the future. And we will reject immediately that this happened in a vacuum, that this happened in a 30-second span, that there was many, if we look at some of the high profile incidents that have done this in the press, there's been many red flags or other problems in the background of an officer or a public servant that could have prevented this. And so we need to do that for the future, for posterity. So I hope those answer your questions, but certainly there are models that do both of what you're referencing.
I have both of those answers are very helpful, and I appreciate that you'll send this information to Tamar, who is key to all of our efforts here. My one other follow-up question, I know, so I'm sitting in Los Angeles. I know that in the sheriff's department, what had been done, and I'm not sure if it's still done today, is most new officers would start in the jails. And I think if you start in the jails, again, I'm naive, but I would think if I'm starting in the jails, I'm dealing with people who are at best already proven that there's, or alleged proven that there's some sort of problem, as opposed to maybe starting with a community-based training where my first action is actually to be in a school with elementary school students and talking about how police officers can be helpful, and then and so that whole dynamic was to change. And so, and I'm totally sort of thinking this up on the fly, but it does seem like that would be just a dramatic change of how an officer views society. And it also may be a change of how society views the officer, that they're not immediately engaging in, a situation where I've called you and you're coming with a gun to do something, but I actually may know the officer or somebody who at least is in a uniform. I don't know if anybody has tried that type of training analysis and done a side-by-side of somebody who started in the jail versus somebody who started in the community. I'd be curious of your thoughts of just an idea like this.
Well, I think you just said it, right? You have a hypothesis, and I think it's a good one, right? It would be great if these types of analyses were thought out, because often I think we skip that second piece, right? What you just said is intuitive. I think that makes sense. Everyone here is probably nodding their head. It's not the best way to introduce an impressionable new frontline person to any field, is to show them probably the part of the area that you want to avoid. You want to avoid arrest. You want to avoid people being there, right? So what you said is intuitive. I can't disagree with it as an idea, but understanding what impact that has, we might find, for instance, in a deeper hypothesis, that they're more depressed, because I would personally be very depressed working in a jail and seeing humanity based in that way. Maybe they're more aggressive, maybe they're not. I don't know what the outcome would be, but I do think that we're starting in the right place, trying to figure out how we're getting to things. And you're right, testing our hypotheses on these issues. I don't know the answer, but I do know that the answer is attainable.
Thank you. Commissioner Emerson.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Menos. I appreciate your testimony. I've had friends in law enforcement that tell me that 75% of the individuals they come in contact with have some level of behavioral health issues or mental illness. And I was just wondering, in your opinion, are you convinced that law enforcement individuals are adequately trained to recognize these behavioral health or mental health issues and process the individuals they come in contact with?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's as high as 75%, but I do agree that there is an outsized and disproportionate number of contacts. And I think that calls for service data and other data that exists out there does highlight that police are involved in a healthy portion, an overwhelming portion of calls that are for mental health or other issues that maybe they aren't the best folks to be involved in. And that's kind of the heart of your question, is that training commensurate? And so one part of my background that I did not highlight is that I'm actually a licensed clinical social worker. In order to become a social worker, it was 2 years after my bachelor's degree, it was 2 years of graduate training, 2 years of internship training, and 3 years in the field to be licensed, all right? I right now would not be effective as effective in every mental health call that's present. So to answer your question, it is not really a reasonable proposition that academy training or training that is 8 hours, 10 hours, 16 hours, even CIT training that exists is enough to really help someone be prepared for that type of interaction or all of the interactions. The general conversation around the country around defunding the police, the part of that conversation that I prefer to focus on is the idea that if we are going to do that, we're trying to reimagine what they should be doing. And I think that it's not even necessarily a question of my opinion, but the opinion of most police leaders that I'm aware of is that this is not a job officers should be doing. It's not a job that they need to be doing. The question really becomes, where do they fit in? Is it a co-responder model? Is it a alternate responder model? And can that be transferable around the country? I think that the answer to my last question is no. I mean, what works in Idaho isn't going to work in Philadelphia and isn't necessarily going to work in LA. But for each jurisdiction to figure out what works best for them. So I apologize for kind of the circuitous answer there. In general, I think there's consensus that the answer is no, that officers are not prepared enough for this, and that it isn't reasonable to suggest that more training will get them there. And I think that when I say consensus, we're talking about police leaders and officers who are part of that consensus.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Any other commissioners have questions? You know, I think what you bring out, you can't manage what you don't. And the points that you bring from your presentation today, as well as your written testimony, and I think, interestingly enough, will be reflected, parts of it, in the testimony from the next two witnesses, who are PORAC and the Police Chiefs Association, and what I find encouraging is that everybody seems to agree that better training, more intelligent training, and follow-up and assessment is critically important for law enforcement professionals so that they can maintain and build trust in the communities where they have the responsibility to provide, to protect and to serve. I want to thank you again. Let me turn to my commissioners. Does anybody have any further questions? I don't see any, but again,
and can I add that the input for that training, the people who are asked to say, what do you want police officers to do and be trained on, needs to include community. It needs to include communities that have historically been harmed by police. So I don't mean to split hairs. I just want to highlight that's an important component. When we start to identify what we're trying to solve, we can't do it alone in rooms. We have to bring in folks. And you guys did that already. I mean, you brought Uncle Bobby in, and that's exactly correct. I mean, hearing from him and hearing from his family that have suffered an unimaginable loss, you know, is an effort to really tap into community. So I applaud you for doing that already. I just feel like we need to continue to do that kind of work.
Thank you very much. I think we all agree. Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you all.
Tamara, would you be so kind?
Yes, of course. So our next witness is Chief Abdul Pridgen. He is Vice President of the California Police Chiefs Association, which represents municipal police chiefs and their agencies in California. He currently serves as Chief of the Seaside Police Department and previously served as the first Black Assistant Chief of the Fort Worth Police Department in Texas. Thank you so much for being here.
Welcome, sir.
Good morning. Thank you, Tamara. I appreciate the introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Abdul Pridgen, and I am Vice President of the California Police Chiefs Association. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you on this critical topic. For background, CPCA represents all 332 municipal police chiefs in California, seconds in command, and retired chiefs throughout the state. As a core function, CPCA produces dozens of training programs and workshops geared towards addressing law enforcement's critical issues and developing leadership skills within the profession. I cannot emphasize enough how essential training is in determining outcomes and outlooks in law enforcement. Training impacts muscle memory for an officer's physical tasks and dramatically influences the overall mindset and perception an officer will carry into the field. Over the last 40 years, law enforcement developed training to create the best crime fighters possible. However, we should have focused more on respect for humanity, empathy, and compassion, emphasizing community collaboration. That is not to suggest our officers do not embody these characteristics, because they do. The blame lies with us, police leaders, for not amplifying and celebrating those traits. Thankfully, that has begun to change. That said, there is much more work to be done. First, we need to shift away from training callousness, which is the ability to face extreme trauma without feeling emotions. Instead, we need to focus on resiliency. Every peace officer will face trauma in their career, which is why many believed it was necessary for officers to develop hard exteriors. But there's a difference between showing no emotion and controlling one's emotions. Officer wellness and mental health are perhaps two of the more significant and overlooked issues facing law enforcement. Officers must be witness to some of the worst events imaginable and are given few skills to cope with the psychological damage which can ensue. Fortunately, a shift has begun and agencies across California are adopting wellness and resiliency training. CPCA has formed a standing committee on officer mental health to address this issue. However, we have not done enough. We need ongoing resiliency training, which begins in the academy and continues throughout an officer's career. If officers have the coping skills before experiencing the trauma, they will be healthier people and better guardians for our communities. We would also hope to see reductions in acute stress, PTSD, depression, and suicide, which plague law enforcement. Second, we need more emphasis on communications, principled policing, procedural justice, de-escalation, crisis intervention, and general problem solving. Communities are asking our officers to help solve problems without employing arrests or other sanctions, and we need to emphasize those skills in our training. There is already a significant amount of work being done in this space, but it needs to continue. Next, while instilling order and discipline in a cadet will always be important, the militaristic nature of the academy must evolve. So much critical information is taught in the academy that the environment should be conducive to learning and absorbing as much information as possible. In that regard, and as daunting as this may seem, we need a wholesale review of the block-style training we utilize. Decades of research reveal that all-day, one-and-done training modes that cram information into a single session without any reinforcement or follow-up are ineffective. Instead, studies indicate spacing out lessons over time, including opportunities for practical application and review, are much more effective in terms of retention and understanding. Of course, this type of systemic change faces its challenges: time, staffing, and costs, to name a few. However, we must explore the possibility. Finally, we need to advance the minimum education requirements to become a peace officer. This year, CPCA has introduced Senate Bill 387 by Senator Anthony Portantino. It will add specific college-level coursework to the post-basic certificate requirement. At the same time, it provides outreach and financial assistance to those from disadvantaged backgrounds who want to pursue a career in public safety. Ultimately, our goal is to create a much more immersive educational pathway for officers. It includes coursework in communications, psychology, sociology, and internships with various social service sectors officers will interact with throughout their careers. Exposing officers to substance abuse treatment facilities, social work, correctional facilities, courtrooms, and mental health providers will give them a holistic view of the systems they will be leveraging. Again, I want to thank you for allowing me to share our views from CPCA. We look forward to working with all stakeholders moving forward, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Commissioner Sidley has raised her hand.
Chief, thank you so much for being here today. I certainly appreciate your perspective, and I think it adds quite a bit to our discussion here. A little bit of follow-up. First, I'd be curious to know, I'm going to ask a series of questions and then leave it to you to opine. Has there been any analysis about how much money might be necessary in order to change the way this training is done? I'm also wondering, is there a bank of professional psychiatric or social worker care for the officer? Is there a group where they can go to get support? And if not, why not? And how do we establish that? And then my final question also is, as you talk about the ongoing training, I'm wondering if there are areas that of problems that police officers are being asked to deal with that really shouldn't be on their plate. And if so, how do we make an effort to remove them from a police officer's requirements? I mean, certainly, I don't know that it is a police officer's duty to deal with the homeless situation, and yet that is very much part and parcel of the job of many police officers. And so, so I'm wondering sort of all of that holistic effort to make sure that a police officer gets the training for the job that the police officer is being asked to do, and also then is the police officer being asked to do too much? I know that's a lot for you, but I'm sort of curious of all of this activity going forward.
Thank you so much for your question, and I will respond to them in reverse order. So first, officers, has been mentioned by some of the other panelists, are not fully equipped to deal with some of the many challenges that they face when it comes to homelessness, substance use disorder, domestic violence, or people suffering a mental health crisis. And that's why when you hear these conversations taking place across the country, really what people are saying is they would prefer someone more qualified to respond to these incidents than police. We agree wholeheartedly. And so that's why many progressive chiefs who have the ability have co-responder models where they have an officer go out with somebody from the social service sector to address some of these issues, or even an independent response, separate and apart from police, where there's no violence or fear of criminality on the scene, where they go and address these things because they're much more equipped or much better equipped and to deal with these than police are. So we agree with that wholeheartedly, but again, funding is a concern because not every city or county has the ability to, to deploy that model. The second question, as far as dealing with the underlying trauma that officers often experience in their careers, that's one of the things that many California agencies have stepped forward to address. And some of the things that progressive leaders are doing, mindfulness training for their officers, yoga training, and things to keep them balanced, and a way to deal with the stressors that come with this profession. The other thing that we're doing, you might have heard of something called Employee Assistance Program. And many departments have that. That's where an officer can call up if they're feeling stressed about a certain issue, they want anonymity, but those particular programs don't receive the level of connection that we would like, because some people are reluctant to deal with an entity that is contracted through the city because they think that word will get back. So other cities have, I won't sell the provider, but there's a provider where you can have an app on your phone and literally go to your phone from the comfort of your own house or wherever you are and connect with someone. And that gives people a greater sense of anonymity that this information is not going to get back to the department. And they're much more likely to take advantage of it if they don't feel that their information will be revealed to people that they work with. Then the final cost, we have not added it up. I can tell you it's a lot, and that's always going to be the hurdle, because whenever you want to change, expand, or enhance training, there's going to be an associated cost with that. And that's the challenge we run into. Who funds it? You know, in some smaller agencies, there's a regional academy. And so they pay for the person to go to the regional academy, but changes can take place more fluidly in larger agencies where they are in control of the training that their recruits receive. So we don't have a price tag, but I know it's a lot.
Thank you. Commissioner Varner, you were unmuted before, and then I know Commissioner Nielsen or Senator Nielsen is. Commissioner Varner?
I don't have a question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My mistake. Senator, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to kind of pipe in here from a perspective of the officers' well-being, and that does influence indeed how they deal with all these circumstances. And I remember about 3 years ago, a meeting here in my office with a bunch of law enforcement professionals. And one of those, she was not a professional, she was a wife of one. And I had been talking about the Peace Officers Memorial that I know you, Commissioner Nava, you've been over to that memorial, and I religiously attend them each year. She said something very instructive, though. She said, Senator, what can we do? My husband's name cannot go up on that wall. And I was pondering that, and I said, was he a suicide? Yes. The point to that is, in your departments, I'm sure that they attend to those psychological, psychiatric needs of the officers. I kind of lived it myself for about almost 10 years. I was chairman of the California Board of Prison Terms, toughest job I will ever have. And the toughest part of that job was to not take home each night that which I was aware of that day. It made me aware of the whole challenge, if it will, for law enforcement professionals to deal with their lives and the rigors of those lives. Now, obviously, we're focusing here more on the individuals who were harmed in some manner by law enforcement. But there is a very dear price that those officers have to pay. And, that strong character is kind of the most important. And I'm sure that the departments are well aware of that and that they attend to it. But it's something that I've really never forgotten. And living it all those years at the board, it showed me. It also showed me sometimes, though it's very depressing, that there's always hope. Hope for individuals who have gone the wrong way and are trying to get their train back on the track. Hope for law enforcement. And right now we've got a serious concern. It was voiced to me just 2 weeks ago by some officers at the funeral for a murdered officer in the Sacramento area. And the issue was this officer's sacrifice, if you will, and the tide that's at play in America today that's damning correctional officers, not praising them. And the deputy said, Jim, how are we going to recruit new officers to fill the positions in the future? Because it's not looked at as a very pleasant job anymore. Just some observations that fit into the overall picture that we are addressing here. Very relevant. I think the point I would conclude, Mr. Chairman and members, is that a lot of factors are at play. Thank you for a moment to make that observation.
Of course, thank you, Senator. Commissioner Aaron.
Good morning, Chief, and thank you very much for your testimony. In listening to all of this, and this is a new issue. These are new issues for me, right? I never have focused necessarily on public safety issues and police training and all of that. And so it's kind of fresh eyes, right? Listening to things and then comparing them to other sectors that I might have been involved with over the years. But in listening, there was a testifier at our last hearing, I think, who said that there are over 4,100 training programs available to police officers that I gather meet the requirements of post, right? And from what I gather, then a police department chooses amongst those 400 programs that are out there and decides what their curriculum is going to look like for their own police department. I'm presuming pursuant to some statutory requirements that there has to be this, that, or the other included in that curriculum. But what I'm really interested in And when you were talking about, when you were asked about what the cost would be, and you said it's going to be very high, that led me to think about, has anybody ever done an assessment of the 4,100 training programs that are out there? Because it would seem to me, we heard somebody make a comment this morning that one of the training components, somebody takes 60 hours of gun training, right, but only takes 8 hours in something regarding community outreach, that kind of thing, and community sensitivity. And so I'm wondering, has anybody has the Chief Police Association looked at what training is out there, what's not, and we've heard what's not so much not even not working, is what's not relevant anymore, and what's the balance between training an officer how to defend themselves as opposed to how to react to the community, that kind of thing, and putting it with the understanding that, as you said, there are lots of things that police officers should not be doing, right? That they're not trained, and you and I are never going to train them well enough to be able to do that. The person right before you has an LCSW, right? And even he said, I don't think I am trained well enough to handle what we ask police officers to deal with. So I'm interested, is anybody looked to say, you know what, we need to get rid of these 500. They don't do anything anymore. Why would you even include them as candidates for being used for training an officer when they have nothing to do with police training in the year 2021?
So that is a great question. And I will start by saying part of the strength of the way training is designed is that municipalities or jurisdictions can tailor it to fit their needs, ensuring that all of the post requirements are met. So there might be some cities that decide this type of training is relevant to our city because officers respond to these types of calls, even though we don't want them to. But the fact is there's nobody else at 3 a.m. to respond. So at least we want them to have a fundamental understanding on how to handle these calls. So that's why you have such a disparity in lesson plans, because everyone has the post mandated courses, and then there are those who decide to add things that are relevant to their communities. And like I mentioned, we don't want to respond to some things, but sometimes we have to. And if we know we have to, there's some level of training that we would like to equip our officers with, so at least they have a fundamental understanding of how to deal with these on a base level. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that there's been an overarching analysis of all of the different training curriculums across the state.
Thank you.
Maybe that whole issue, thank you, Commissioner Aaron, that whole issue with respect to the number of training courses. So what is the there has to be a financial incentive for a vendor, because I don't know what else to call them, for a vendor to develop a block of training. Because I'm guessing that what happens is a vendor comes up with an idea about a certain kind of training within a certain particular area, has to submit the material, the approach, lesson plan, so to speak, to POST, because the way I understand it, POST then looks at it and says, okay, you can add this to the list of things that are offered to officers. So then that vendor is paid by whom in order to produce the training and to market it? Does anybody on this call know how that happens?
I'll take a stab at it. So I think you framed it well, in that if there's a new course that's going to be introduced, that person has to get it approved through POST so that it can be taught. But if it's not taught in an academy, which would be by the instructors that are assigned to that academy, or even if it's a large agency, the members of that department would be teaching it. If it's outside of that, then the agency that wants to host the training would have to pay for that instructor to host the training.
All right, so that helps me understand, how it is that you end up 4,600 courses, because somebody's hoping that they're going to be able to persuade a jurisdiction to enter into a contract with them to pay them for providing the training and the service. So I mean, it seems to me that we're really approaching an important area, which is exactly what Commissioner Aroner said. I mean, you got 4,600 courses that are out there. How come so many, right? And do they really make a difference, and are they helpful to anyone?
And who's driving the show here? Yeah. Is it that the policing community, meaning the chiefs, et cetera, right, are saying, here's what we think the needs are, right? Therefore, go, let's see what's out there, right? Or let's commission somebody to develop whatever it is because we think this is the need. Or are these vendors driving it by saying, I've got a great idea, right, for something, and it's sexy this week, right? This is an issue we have in the legislature on a regular basis of somebody coming to a legislator and saying, have I got a great idea for training, right? And all of a sudden it's now a new training requirement in some sector when it's like, wait a minute, it might be sexy for today, but it's not so terrific tomorrow anymore, right? And so I'm just kind of trying to figure out who's driving the show here. Mm-hmm. Is it the police community and the community at large, as was spoken to by the previous speaker, who's deciding what they think should be trained in the academies through post, because I'm having a hard time really figuring that out.
That's a great question. will tell you in my experience, vendors have less of a role in what gets taught at a training academy. Because as chiefs, we want to prepare our officers as best as possible to deal with the many challenges that they'll face in their respective communities. Not what somebody thinks might work that worked in Arizona. Let's layer it on top of California and see if it works. Yeah. We want to see data to support that this program works. And if it's effective somewhere else, let's review it and see, maybe pilot it somewhere to see if it works before there's some wholesale acceptance of something that somebody thought up, maybe over a latte at Starbucks. So we put a lot of time and effort into making sure that whatever we endorse has proven results to back it up.
Thank you.
Chief, if I may, sort of on this same line of questioning, the academies, do they sort of function a little bit like a university, that there are core curriculum and then there are electives? Or is it something that for an officer to select what courses? Or is it something where in your mind or in your experience that chiefs say, for my police force, this is going to be your core classes of whatever number of hours you have to take? I'm just wondering how that works.
So great question. It's the latter. So particularly for large agencies that have full control over their academies, but they have to include post-mandated courses, then it's up to them what they feel is important for their communities to receive from their officers. And then they add that, because most agencies go above and beyond the courses that are required by post, because there's just so much more that they need to be qualified and capable of performing when they leave the academy, that the post is just the foundation. And even the regional academies, where smaller agencies send people to be trained, they have a la carte, well, I shouldn't say a la carte, but they have a curriculum that you go through. It's not like I'd like to take that course instead of, because you've got 40 or 50 people. You don't have the luxury of saying these two people would prefer a different class. So it's really, what are the foundational courses above and beyond posts that we think are needed in this jurisdiction or in this county?
So the electives of sort are done by the chief, and then everybody in that jurisdiction, that municipality, takes the same curricula.
Correct. And in most counties, the chiefs meet regularly to talk about the training that their officers are receiving and anything that they believe needs to be incorporated. But as you might know, it's a bureaucracy, so it takes a lot of time to get something changed to a curriculum that you think is relevant and necessary for your employees.
Are there courses right now that are lacking that you think need to be added?
Yes.
I mean, I know you talked about how there needs to be more mental health, more awareness and things like that. Are those courses not available, or you haven't been able to, they're available, but you haven't been able to incorporate them?
So they touch on it, but from my perspective, it needs to be a focal point throughout training, because this is sort of a lifestyle change, taking care of yourself, your mental well-being. And if you learn those things throughout the academy, not just one block, but maybe reminders and You know, maybe portions of every week you do yoga or mindfulness, whatever it is, so that you carry that habit with you when you start your career in your new department. So that would be the preference, but I don't know that that's happening on a wide scale at this point.
And would that be in order to, I'm sorry, last question, if I may. Is that something that we could make a suggestion that post change how they do their training, and that the core courses should include this type of wellness training throughout? Is that where the actual change needs to happen in legislation to post, or how would that happen?
It can happen a number of ways, but for it to be simplest, it would be at the post level, where post says this is now a required course that has to be taught periodically throughout every single academy. That would be easiest because it would apply to everyone in the state of California, as opposed to piecemeal in a different county or a different city.
Right. Commissioner Byer and Commissioner, okay, Commissioner Arner and then Commissioner Byer.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to follow up on that because I'm interested in whether or not your line staff, meaning the beat cop, et cetera, are you hearing from them that they want that kind of training as well regarding their own personal mindfulness, et cetera? And are they bringing it up in contract negotiations around, that kind of thing? Because that to me is where it would play out, that they would start demanding some of those things for themselves. Is that happening at all?
I can't speak for all of the agencies, but I know it's a topic of conversation about overall wellness, not just from a physical standpoint, but from a psychological standpoint, and looking for resources that help them through their careers as they navigate all the challenges that come in this profession.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner.
Thank you for your testimony. I have two questions. They're not connected. The first is, during our first hearing, I asked the witness about stress versus non-stress training. And I didn't get a very good answer about how post differentiates between those two kinds of training. And interested in your experience, because that differentiation of a high stress situation where use of force is a more likely outcome versus an academic setting where it's more of an intellectual exercise. What can you tell us about the wisdom of a mix between those two styles of training in terms of what's an optimal way of securing a well-functioning police officer?
Great question.
Take the
great question.
Answer in the second question.
So I think there is a need for some level of stress for someone to operate under, to demonstrate that they're capable of controlling their emotions at the height of stress and doing things the way they are trained to do them in a stepwise fashion. And sometimes you have to skip steps on the ladder. But without that stress, the first opportunity would be when they're in the field, which could be more problematic if they haven't demonstrated the ability to be able to manage stress, because that's what many of these calls require. And so there is a portion where you get the lecture on the principles of how to de-escalate and those types of things. And then you're put in scenarios where stress is induced in a number of ways to see how you cope with the stress on a particular call or in a particular scenario.
Okay. The second question relates to organized labor. In general, from your experience, what role do organized labor organizations play in shaping, formulating, or commenting on training?
Great question. In most jurisdictions, there's a collaborative conversation about training. And in most situations, the chief has the ultimate say, but they want to understand what the officers and, I would say, even labor think about a particular training avenue and whether they think it'll be efficacious. And usually there's some agreement about how to move forward with training. And in some cases, a chief will say, I appreciate the input and the feedback. This is what's important for our agency and we're going to implement it. But most times there's a collaborative conversation that takes place and there's some agreement on it.
How does it relate to the collective bargaining process in terms of being paid for time doing training, time traveling to training, et cetera? In other words, is this something that's bargainable?
So in the state of California, which I came from another state, so I was pleasantly surprised to learn that anyone in the agency who attended post-training got reimbursed through the state, which didn't happen where I came from. So that's not really a concern for most agencies. And it's not necessarily something that would need to be bargained because they're already being reimbursed from the state when they go to post-certified training.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other commissioners who have questions or comments at this point? I'm not seeing any. I want to, express thanks to you, Chief, for your presentation.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, if I may interrupt, I apologize. Commissioner Schwamberger just raised her hand.
Of course, Kathy, please go ahead.
I did. Thank you. In your estimation, what would be the receptivity on the part of the officers and the labor union if there were more training in this whole arena of culture and community policing and compassion and implicit bias and really a heightened level of training in those particular areas to get at some of these issues? What would be the receptivity of that?
That's a great question. So I've got experience in that area because I used to be a liaison for the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, which taught implicit bias, procedural justice, and reconciliation. So initially there was some resistance, like, what do we need that stuff for? Because we already operate with compassion and respect and with professionalism. But after having attended the course, they're like, wow, I didn't know that stuff. I'm glad I took the course. So that's typically how it works.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Again, any other commissioners? Seeing none. I want to very much for your presentation. It's given us a great deal to think about. And it's fair that I was encouraged by was reading through the documents, both what you prepared as well as what PORAC prepared, in how inclusive it was and how there is a recognition that there needs to be a different perspective on the kind of training, the quality of training, and the different sort of training. And I just find it, again, encouraging that we have peace officers and leadership like yourself who are emphasizing the whole issue of wellness. I was a deputy DA for years in Fresno and Santa Barbara County, and became familiar with the sorts of stresses that peace officers are confronted with. And again, part of what Senator Nielsen was referring to was making sure that we are conscious of how the profound relationship between peace officers and the community they protect and they serve. And was very glad to for Mr. Johnson's wife, who offered her comments, because too often the conversation is pejorative about peace officers, when in fact what she emphasized was that there were 3 peace officers who saved her life, that she wouldn't be where she was today had it not been for police officers in her community who saw something in her and mentored her and offered hope and inspiration. And so I am just glad to see, as we work through this study, more and more of that coming to the surface about the cooperative relationship and the deep, profound connection between people who have sworn a duty to help their community, to serve their community, and the relationship that we need to nurture so that we can become everything that we are potentially able to do. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you for having me.
Tamara?
All right, thank you. We have one more witness before our public comment session. So our last witness is Mr. Damon Kurtz. He is Vice President of the Peace Officers Research Association of California, which is a professional federation of local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. He has served as a police officer with the Fresno Department for 14 years and previously served as Deputy Sheriff with the Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo Sheriff's Departments. Welcome, Mr. Kurtz, and thank you for being here.
No, thank you. I think my bio needs to be updated. I think I'm moving on to 17 years with the Fresno this year. So
this is
keeps going by fast.
Hi, this is Pedro Nava, and it's really interesting. I served as a prosecutor in Fresno County and also in Santa Barbara County. So I'm sure that
I heard that.
Yeah.
I maybe started thinking about your name and going, where have I seen that before? So, but thank you for having me. Again, my name's Damon Kurtz. I'm the Vice President of PORAC, Peace Officers Research Association of California. Currently representing a little over 900 associations across the state and roughly 77,000 members in the law enforcement and public safety community. We pretty much we provide resources to our law enforcement and first responders through health and disability insurances, retiree medical trust, our legal defense program as well. And also often focus on political advocacy through legislative issues that affect law enforcement and give that perspective to our legislators as they for different legislative items each year. Currently, obviously, we're focused a lot on training as this commission is focused on. Always a big part of what PORAC does is focus on the training of our officers. We also provide training opportunities for them and focus on officer wellness. We were one of the first organizations to focus on things like body-worn cameras. And in 2019, along with the use of force bill, we partnered with the police chiefs and California Highway Patrol on Senate Bill 230, which focused on de-escalation and on mental health training. Often focusing also on, a standardization of recruitment and the retention of officers, not only here in the state, but also at a national level, to try to get some standardization on how we're recruiting officers and how we're training our officers. Obviously, we know that that is not going to transcend all jurisdictions on what that training looks like, but there are certain principles that I think that could be, or we think that could be a standardization across all levels, every state, when it comes to, what it is to be a law enforcement officer. Also recognizing that, as the chiefs talked about, is how much training goes into each officer, and recognizing that we cannot put it all into an academy. And I don't know that it'd be absorbed also in the academy. And right now there's so much training that we try to push on the officers, and there's not a lot of experience yet at that point. And so while we're looking at what we're trying to do through Senate Bill 387 with Portantino partnering with the chiefs and the California Highway Patrol on focusing on extending that training and finding ways to better train those officers in mental health and other areas outside of the academy, so they have some kind of work experience when they're doing it, and so that maybe it plays a part into what their certification process goes. So I'm going to keep my comments short and open it up for questions. That way we can focus on the issues at hand. So that's all I have.
Thank you. Let's take a look. Commissioner Emerson, I think.
No, I
oh, I'm sorry, you're unmuted. I looked for the little. I mean, at you questions that you want to raise. Let me turn to any other commissioners who want to. If not, what I do want to, since I'm already talking, I noticed in your written remarks references to particular levels of education that then correspond to disciplinary actions.
Correct.
You want to touch on that for a bit?
Yeah. So there's been studies that show the differences in officers' performances when it's based on sorry, my computer just produced levels of education, and how officers with only high school educations are subject to 75% of all disciplinary actions, which is it's a pretty high number, obviously. And then on average, officers with undergraduate degrees performed on par with officers that had 10 years of experience. So and a college degree significantly reduces the likelihood of officers to use force as their first option and gain compliance, as educated officers. So recognizing that we obviously need to focus on, a higher standard of education with our members and our officers out there to try to, change the interaction with the public, and I think better education and emotional awareness is part of that, and they can get that through higher education. That's what we're trying to focus on with SB 387 with Portantino.
Yeah, we have had some conversations, those of us that are on the subject, on the connection, the relationship between higher education and policing styles. And part of what I think, and I remember Commissioner Sidley had said something about, do we really want to attempt to impose the requirement of a college degree for a new police officer? And how would that impact the field that you're recruiting from? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. So, we recognize that, law enforcement is still seen as a blue collar profession, and it's something that you can go into with a high school education. But we also recognize that there's a need to continue to educate those officers to maybe bring their education level up. And I think there's a way to do that, while doing the profession, and maybe in a way that it's focused versus, say, going to a college in a college atmosphere and taking courses that may or may not translate into what they're doing on the job, much like, say, nurses will do, where they go through some college courses, but then there is an on-the-job training where there's internships, and that's kind of what we're looking at, something along those lines, where you'd go through an academy, and then there's additional courses and training that would have to take place after the academy that would take place before you would receive maybe your basic certificate that says, hey, I've gone further. And then it would probably be more meaningful, that training, having now been in the field, gone through some of the training, and understanding how to apply that stuff that you're learning.
Right. And it just, there's a point that is made in your written testimony about working with community colleges to establish a degree program that's specific to the practice of law enforcement. And I think one of the things that would help me is, can you walk me through what happens if I were to apply to if I were like 40 years younger and were to apply to become a peace officer? What is the process? What is the process to become a peace officer? So
it can be fairly lengthy, and that's part of the problem with recruitment is, so you would apply, and if you're accepted as a candidate, there's going to be an interview process, obviously, once you're accepted, and then there's a lengthy background that can take quite some time to get through, usually 3 or 4 months, depending on the organization, how long it takes to go through. Then there's medical, psychologicals that go through. Once you're accepted and you're actually hired and you have to go to an academy, then you go through the academy, which is, I think, roughly 685 hours, somewhere in that ballpark. And it takes roughly 6 months to complete. Upon completion of that 6 months academy, you'll then go to your field training program, which is typically a minimum of 16 weeks. And that's provided you didn't have any type of slow down because you had stuff that you needed to remediate, and that's to where they release you to go drive around in a car on your own. So it can take almost a year by the time from start to finish or more before you're released on your own. And then there's a probationary period that follows that before you receive your basic certificate. You're muted, sir.
Thanks. So is the academy an actual physical place, like, a brick and mortar facility where I sit in a classroom and receive instruction?
Yes, there are several around the state. Some agencies, the large ones, have their own, and some even as large agencies like Ventura Sheriff's Department puts on one, but they also take outside agencies as well into their academy. And several of the community colleges have one. Fresno has one. Allen Hancock College in Santa Maria has one. And Rio Hondo in Southern California. So there's several out there. And then obviously Post provides that curriculum like the chief spoke of. And then each academy may add different nuances based on the communities there, but there's a core curriculum that has to be followed.
Well, and you see that the thing that it just struck me is during this period of time when I'm hired and I'm going to the academy, That's reimbursed by the state of California to the department. Is that correct?
I don't know how much the academy is actually reimbursed to the state. That was something being a question for the chief, but follow-up trainings after you're an officer, periodically post will put on different trainings, or different organizations will put on trainings. Fresno has a regional training center, and there'll be a post, let's say it's a post accredited class on EVOC, which is the driving skills. Mm-hmm. And the different agencies will come there, they'll attend that, and then their agency will get reimbursed for sending their officers to these trainings, these additional trainings, these perishable skills, if you will, in additional trainings. As far as the academy, a lot of the larger organizations will send folks to the academy and pay them a wage while they're going to the academy, but there's a large number of folks who put themselves through, say, a community college academy, just like you would any college course, in hopes of being hired as a police officer. And that's one of the focuses also of our bill, that eventually is find funding mechanisms or grants so that there's scholarships, if you will, for those in underprivileged communities that can afford to send them to an academy. Often the wages to go to an academy at a cadet level aren't very high, and they may be a pay cut for someone to leave a job somewhere and they have a family and the ability to go into law enforcement, and it makes it difficult to recruit that segment of the community that we're really looking for. We want that diversity, but it's very hard to find the good candidates and bring them into this profession.
So that's part of what a Pridgen team would address.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a lengthy process. We don't want to say, hey, this is the answer. We want to look at it and figure out the best way. And that's why there's a partnership with the UCs and the community colleges. How can we put something together, and how can we do something to bring people law enforcement and also make it not a financial hardship to do so? Obviously we want the higher education, but we also want folks that want to come, and if we have to do whatever we can to get them in.
Right. Commissioner Seaman, I'll get the. I have just one other question. Do you know whether or not there has been an analysis done on what it costs a jurisdiction to hire an individual to be a peace officer up until the time that they're actually then complete their field training and then are on their own, so to speak?
There has, and it's individual to each organization based on their salaries or whatever. Someone in Central California versus, say, the Bay Area, that there'll be a little bit of disparity in that cost, but it is in the several hundred thousands when you talk about the man hours put into providing someone from the academy through field training.
Yeah, and I don't, this is actually the first that it occurred to me that we have not talked about the expense to a jurisdiction, to recruit and then to hire and then to get them to the place where they become a functioning officer in the community. Thank you. Commissioner Sidley.
Actually, Pedro, I was just building on that specific question. I was wondering if you could tell me, what is the opening salary generally for a police officer, for a cadet? I know it's going to range, but what is that range, if you happen to know that?
So for a cadet in the academy, it ranges widely based on the organization and how they want to structure it. But it could be as low as $18 an hour, all the way up to what a basic officer makes. But typically, it's going to be less, and there's usually a waiting period for certain benefits and things like that. But
and then when an officer is hired, what's the range for the starting salary, first year officer out of the academy?
Again, it varies greatly. You can usually starting somewhere around $50,000 to $60,000 a year, and topping out somewhere 80, 90, and in some cases, like I said, in the Bay Area where cost of living is pretty high, those base salaries go over 100,000.
Thank you. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm gonna call on Commissioner Schwamberger, but first I have one question. Does PORAC have information as to how many officers are working in communities where they can't afford to live?
That's a great question. I know it happens a lot. It is especially now in California, it's very commonplace. As you know, I worked in Santa Barbara, and even when I started there in 1994, it was fairly expensive for me to reside there. And I frequently go back there for meetings with our membership there, and often most of them are commuting at least an hour to work.
Yeah.
They can't afford to live in the community that they're working, and that's a problem. I don't know how you fix that, but that is a definite problem. I know for San Jose, a huge issue for them. When you look at Santa Clara County and the median home price is 1.23 million or more, an officer's salary, even at $100,000, is not going to qualify for a home in that area.
No.
So
No.
it's definitely an issue. I don't know that we have hard numbers on that, but it's specific to each, jurisdiction.
Yeah, and it raises a question. On the one hand, you want peace officers who are connected to the community where they work, but they leave at night, right? I mean, I know for example, for firefighters in Santa Barbara, there's one location where the fire district purchased 3 homes so that firefighters who live outside the area would spend their 4 days or whatever, doing fire protection, staying in these 3 homes owned by the fire district, and then at the end of their 3rd or 4th day, they drive out of town.
They're doing that as well. They're with police departments. They're basically building a barracks, if you will, for officers that they can come and if they're getting off late or whatever, they can stay, or if they're coming from a distance. That's definitely an issue.
Yeah, Commissioner Schwaber.
Yeah, 2 questions for you, and I'll just ask one at a time. So the first one, if the goals for training are to improve quality interaction between the officers and the citizens, especially people of color, and decrease the incidence of excessive use of force, what's your thought on what subjects the training should focus on more to achieve those training goals?
Well, I think, when we talk about that, you have to kind of focus on, the core issue, which is community-based policing. And it means something to everybody, I think. But, I coined this phrase a while back and folks kind of laugh at me about it. But, we as law enforcement community and also the public, they kind of characterize this in a certain way. You look in the media and Hollywood, and so much is focused on the hard-nosed cop and the the tactical guy, when we really need a little more Andy Griffith in our life right now. And I think that's where the focus needs to be on the training when it comes to, that community-based policing is where we need to get to, is understanding your community where you're at, and not just your community, but all. But, like I work in Fresno, and it's quite the melting pot of different cultures, whether it's Asian, Black, Hispanic, or whatever. And you have to find the time to learn about those cultures and be sensitive to different issues that you may encounter when you go on those calls, and understand what's going on. And that doesn't count all the mental health issues, but I think that those are probably the core issues, is really just cultural awareness and maybe some exposure, in that training to those folks from the community that can come in and talk about, hey, when someone does this, it's not a threat. It's just, this is their culture. This is the way they communicate or whatnot. And having that would be huge. But often it's very difficult. In this day and age, everything's about budgets and trying to find time to get the adequate amount of training for these officers, and also making sure through normal vacancies that we have enough officers out there in the street. And then being out there, there's a demand because there's a call load. Hey, get to this call, get to this call, get to this call. And there's typically not enough time for them to establish those relationships within their community at the patrol level, especially in these larger agencies, say like in Fresno. So how we tackle that in not only a training setting, but in an application at the street level when they're out there dealing with the communities, it's a challenge.
That's great input, because we've heard
kind of going around, but
no, I appreciate that, because we've heard a lot about there's so much training available, and how do they choose the right training, choose training that's effective, choose training that's been thoughtfully put together to achieve the goal, right? Otherwise it's just training. But here's my second question. Our first witness talked about the policing culture being such an important part of these issues that we're talking about. Do you feel like the right training can over time affect and improve that policing culture?
Absolutely, I do. You know, the chief talked about wellness training and taking care of the officers themselves. The stress that comes with the job, and then there's the stress of not wanting to show weakness to your fellow officers. That's been part of the culture for years, right? They used to, and slowly that's changed. It's nice to see, and being part of the association, where I was the president, and we have peer support programs, and you're always really focused on that officer wellness portion. And it was sad to see during the recession, a lot of the wellness programs were the first things to be cut, right? Because they had a cost to them, but there wasn't necessarily something tangible for your city councils and board supervisors to see, and they're looking for ways to cut. And then in most places, those haven't come back. But what we're seeing now is not only are we focused on mental health in our community, we're focused on the mental health of our officers, because it does affect behavior. And I think that's important. And so the more we train, not only on the mental health of our community and culture, diversity, all these issues, and bias, and bias is another issue that really is about educating, because people sometimes don't even recognize they have it. Same thing with the stressors of law enforcement. I think we need to train people on not only do recognize that they're having some sort of response to that stress, how do I de-escalate myself and work on self-regulation, and so that I can have better outcomes, not only at work, but also at home.
Yeah. Thank you. Very much appreciate your responses on that.
Thank you. Commissioner Bonner?
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. My question is related to how much police training can benefit from research done in other fields. That is, training of the military or in healthcare. And let me explain why I have that question. I'm a member of a hospital board in San Francisco, and we focus a lot on trying to be culturally sensitive. And one of the things that has been observed is in certain neighborhoods where there are large numbers of people from countries where the government was oppressive, that government was torturing its own people, or there were gangs sponsored by the government, that the idea of I'm from the government and I'm here to help you was not going to be plausible. Secondarily, or relatedly, language barriers were a big problem. So what I'm wondering is, training in the context of other occupations. There's a lot of research that suggests how to do it and how to improve it. How much of that learning is applied with respect to the police and police training?
So I'm trying to grasp how to answer this, so that, in police training, I mean, they were always looking for better outcomes. And so there's, not only are we looking in other fields, or looking in to incidents that may have happened in other jurisdictions, and how can we apply that to what may or may not happen in my jurisdiction to have better outcomes. There's a constant need to, better our profession, so I don't know if I'm answering the question correctly, but I do think that there's a huge benefit to look outside of what we do to see what other professions are doing, that if there's a correlation somewhere, particularly when you're in a profession, so like say the medical field, where you're literally having to, it's crisis management as well, depending on what the issue may be, and having to work through that crisis to be able to help that individual and convince them that you're there to help them. How do you go about that? What's successful there? And could that then be applied to law enforcement? So from that perspective, yeah, I do think that there's definitely a benefit to look outside of our own ranks to better our profession.
Right. Well, to respond briefly, it seems as though from the testimony we heard at the last hearing, the connection between the training and outcome in terms of sophistication of the data is not very strong. And
no,
I guess my point is learning how other professions, other situations have been able to overcome those data impediments. In other words, what do you collect and how do you assess it? As Chairman Nabra's point was, if you don't collect data, you're not valuing it. And in the case of police training, it seems as though if we were to suggest improved data collection, we ought to know what we're talking about. And maybe we need to look beyond just the police training components, because there's some common components from these other high stress occupations. Peacekeepers in the military have to be trained about how to deal with the community, yet they have to be worried about terrorism. In the case of critical care medicine, you have to be able to effectively communicate with people who are under high stress, either themselves as a patient or their family members, and oftentimes in a context where you don't speak the language or don't understand the culture. So there are some lessons that could be learned, and I'm really trying to fathom how police officers and the trainers can benefit from those other situations.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the chief talked about inducing stress in the academy, and that's basically through scenario based. And you know, whether it's the military or law enforcement, the best training you can get is through a scenario based, where you have to immerse yourself in the situation and go through those motions of what the training, hey, this is textbook what you're supposed to do. Now, can you perform that under stress and in situations when, you know, the person you're dealing with is, you know, is erratic or, you know, under stress themselves, and how do you respond to theirs? And, you know, can you de-escalate that situation, or try to somewhat come up with a plan on how to do that? And then hopefully when you get out in the field, try to apply that. But the benefit of looking outside of law enforcement is I think it's there. And I know that we do that, but I can't tell you to what extent. And, you know, and even when you look at the data collection, it's only good as the information that you have. And there's always missing components of that data, because you can't, there's no way to collect everything, you know, so it's, we just keep trying to do better.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Byer. Thank you, Mr. Kurtz. Any further questions or comments for this witness from commissioners? Seeing none. Again, I want to express my thanks and our gratitude to you for taking the time to participate and for your thoughtful comments, both as a witness and in the written testimony. And as I said, I'm just encouraged to see a much more inclusive perspective, because law enforcement sometimes hasn't been perceived as sort of embracing the larger idea. And I also think there's going to be tremendous benefit from having law enforcement actively engaged in pursuing, you know, wellness strategies and approaches, right? You're not going to want to go with who does Goop? What is her name? Remember that woman who does that sort of wellness thing called Goop? You're not going to go there. But I just think it's a great example for members of the community to see that law enforcement understands that emotional wellness is a critical component of one's humanity. It's going to make a big difference. And thank you guys for being ahead of all of that. Thank you, sir. So with that, I think tomorrow we've completed our witness lineup, correct? And let me just again express appreciation. Tomorrow's was that I think we had some extraordinary witnesses today. Very, very, very well done. This would then be the time, I think, Ethan, that we can turn to public comment.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. So we'll move into the public comment section of the agenda, and I'll ask the staff to put up the instructions for public comment onto the screen. For members of the public who are on the call, you may raise your hand in Zoom using the raised hand function in Zoom. Or if you have phoned into the meeting, you may send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. That address is on your screen now, littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. It's important that if you email us, you include your name and the phone number from which you have joined the meeting. That will tell the staff who to unmute when you are called upon for public comment. Commissioners will be able to hear you when you're making public comment, but they will not be able to see you. We will turn on your audio, but not your video. And in keeping with the Commission's traditional practice for public comment, we ask public comment to be limited to 3 minutes per speaker. So please try to keep your comments to 3 minutes. So we'll now take public comment. And I know that I believe one member of the public has already raised his hand. Mr. Johnson, who was actually the first witness today, has raised his hand, I believe, to make public comment. So I'll ask the staff to go ahead and turn on his audio. And Mr. Johnson, if that is correct and you wish to make public comment, please go ahead. Mr. Johnson?
He's muted.
He is muted. Rachel, if you can unmute him, please.
I have asked him to unmute, but I haven't seen any.
Mr. Johnson, you need to unmute yourself. I believe so Rachel, we've authorized him to unmute. He just needs to unmute himself, correct?
Correct. I could promote him to a panelist and see if that would work better.
Please go ahead and, well, he'll still have to unmute himself, won't he?
I believe so, yes.
Go ahead and promote him to a panelist and see if that will address the issue. And commissioners, I apologize for the slight technical snafu here.
No, he was, then he went back.
Yes.
He was unmuted, then he went back to
Mr.
mute.
Johnson, you were unmuted for half a second. And he has now been promoted to a panelist and remains muted. So Mr. Johnson, if you're able to unmute yourself, we'd be happy to take public comment, but I'm not sure. At this point, he remains muted.
Right.
Mr. Johnson, I apologize. You can, Mr. Johnson, if you wish to make additional public comment, I might suggest that perhaps you either, you may submit additional written material to the commission, or you can join our next hearing on this same topic, which will be 2 weeks from today on March 11th, and we'll work with you in the meantime to try to address any technical issues. So,
I think he tried to come back in.
Yeah, he's trying. Here we are, Mr. Johnson. Can you? I believe you're unmuted now.
Okay, this is Mrs. Johnson.
Okay.
So he had to go back to work, right?
Okay.
So the computer was on because I was listening. So how I raised my hand, I do not know.
Okay. Well, please go ahead, ma'am.
He's listening and called me and told me your hand is waved, but I don't know. He probably did it before he left. But I just wanted to say, I think that today is very important so that we can find a way to have peace in the community. Because from our vantage point as a community and how I feel, a lot of the reason why there is not peace in the community between police and the community is the way they come into the community, period. If you come in respecting all life, regardless of creed or color, then you're going to get that respect back. If you come into the community and you're a good officer, then you're going to get that respect. But if you come into the community doing things that people know that is against the law and that officers are not supposed to do, then how is people going to respect you? I remember this when I was getting ready to almost go to juvenile hall because I was fighting, but it wasn't my fault, but I was defending myself. And this officer, Michael Johnson, instead of him, because it was a white officer who told him to take me to juvenile hall, but he didn't. He took me down the street in Phoenix and he let me out. But when he was letting me out, he was fussing. He was like, you know what? You a smart girl. You're supposed to do this, this, and this. And he said a bad word. And to me, I was like, oh, you said a bad word. That was my whole thing, walking down the street screaming. Not that, okay, he done let me go. Little did I know that I would grow up and learn that police, that was nothing. But however, what I was going to say is that it's the way that police officers come into our community. And I'm not saying our community don't have issues, and we all know that they do, but I know that it's the way that the police officers come in our community. And if you come in our community and you're a good officer, even people that don't like police officers, or somebody say, oh, that's a good officer, they might even get into it because, you know what I'm saying, they're defending that officer. So it's the way that the police come into our communities that we absolutely have to consider. And if you don't have respect for our life and for us, then you're not going to treat us right. And I think that's what we see over and over and over again. If you go back to George Floyd and watch that officer put that knee on him for that long, for that very long, how many officers have that mentality? And so I think that's the mentality that we have to break up. And I think that if we start doing legislation that hold police accountable, it'll be okay. Everybody is held accountable. Everybody is held accountable. The police must be held accountable and they must comply, because when 1421 was passed, we weren't able to access this right away because the police association was fighting it. But it's just the right to know. And if you have bad officers, why wouldn't you want us to know that? Why wouldn't you want us to know that so we can rid them, so we can bring in good officers? And so I think this panel today was very important. And I think that we really, really, really not just talk it, but we really have to make changes to hold police accountable.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank
you. Rachel, I do not see any other raised hands. Is that correct?
That's correct. No other raised hands, and we have not received any emails for public comment.
Okay, then, Mr. Chairman, I think we can conclude public comment. And
I apologize to interrupt.
Yep.
We just did get another raised hand for public comment.
Very good.
Can you identify that person and go ahead and...
Yes, next up we have Norma Nelson. So Norma, I will unmute you on my end, but please make sure you are unmuted on your end to begin public comment.
Okay, thank you so much for allowing me to speak. It was such a wonderful opportunity to be able to listen to the hearings today, the testimonies. And I think that it was kind of touched upon, but I just wanted to bring it up directly, the issue of qualified immunity and the role that that plays in being able to do effective community oriented policing. And in a lot of respects, it would solve a lot of problems that we have in the community involving the violence against people of color in the community, and addressing some of the accountability issues around training and dealing with misconduct. So I was just kind of wondering if that's something that's going to be talked about directly, and if anything can be done around that. So that's the only comment that I had. So thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
And Rachel, I believe we have no other raised hands or emails. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, then, Mr. Chairman, I believe we have concluded public comment and concluded the agenda. I would briefly remind commissioners the next hearing will be on 2 weeks from today on March 11th, also on the subject of law enforcement training. And then 2 weeks after that on March 25th, we have a business meeting scheduled at which we expect to have reports for commission on which we will seek commission approval, and we will hold commission elections at that March 25th meeting. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Again, let me express my thanks to all of the commissioners for attending the meeting and for your contribution. Thanks to staff for another job well done, and look forward to seeing you on the 11th. Please stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you.